You may have a sense that as you're getting older, perhaps the quantity and the quality of your You may have a sense that as you're getting older, perhaps the quantity and the quality of your sleep is a little bit harder to come by. And we know that aging will slowly deteriorate the quality and the quantity of your sleep. When we're very young, in fact, even when we're in utero, we spend most of our time not in non-rapid eye movement sleep, not in deep non-REM sleep, but actually in REM sleep. And then in the first 2 years of life, we continue to feast on rapid eye movement sleep. And it's about a 50-50 distribution. So in our first 2 years of life, about 50% of our time is spent in non-REM sleep, and about 50% of that sleep time is spent in REM sleep. So as we shift from infancy through to childhood and then into our teenage years, we start to feast much more on non-rapid eye movement sleep and less on REM sleep. And once we get to adulthood, we seem to have this sort of 4-to-1 ratio, almost like if you're thinking about mixing a sleep cocktail, it would be 4 parts non-REM and 1 part REM. As we get older, the continuity of our sleep decreases. In other words, we start to wake up more often and we spend more time awake throughout the night. What we've also found is that the electrical quality of our sleep will begin to decline. And in fact, it starts to happen quite early. We can see the decline in your deep sleep electrical brain quality happening in your mid to late 30s. And then it declines significantly. In fact, the drop in deep sleep quality in particular is perhaps one of the most remarkable and robust physiological changes that we see across the entire lifespan. Doesn't that mean older adults simply just need less sleep? And the answer seems to be no, that's not true. It would be a little bit like saying, well, as we get older, our bones become weaker. So doesn't that just mean that older adults need weaker bones? Well, no, that increases their risk of fracture if they fall, and we actually will supplement the diet of older adults with things such as calcium to try and improve the strength of their bones. But we don't appreciate and think about sleep in that same way. And that's one of the myths. It's not as though we need less sleep as we get older. It's simply that our brains, as they deteriorate, just like the rest of our bodies, our brains can't generate the sleep that they still necessarily need. One of the other features that we know happens as we get older is not just a change in the quantity and the quality of our sleep, but also a change in our circadian rhythm. And more specifically, the strength of the signal of the circadian rhythm being drummed out by the brain actually starts to become a little bit more shallow, a little bit more muted. As we get older, we may find it more difficult to be active and alert during the day because we don't get the strong or as strong a signal from our circadian rhythm of the drive to be awake. And then similarly, we don't get the same type of beautiful drop and downward slope at night. And so as a consequence, we don't get the same signal of darkness, the same signal to be asleep at night. We can typically feel a little bit more sleepy during the day, and certainly we don't have as strong a circadian signal to be sleeping at night. And in part, that's because the brain isn't releasing as much melatonin, and as a result, we don't get that same strength of darkness signal for sleep. Back when I was doing my PhD work, I was studying people with different forms of dementia, and I was trying to use brainwave activity to see if I could diagnose the different forms of dementia very early on. And I was getting no good results whatsoever. One weekend, I was reading some journals, and it seemed to be that some of these dementias would eat away at certain regions in the brain that would control sleep. Whereas for other types of dementia, they would leave those sleep centers untouched. And I realized that I was measuring my patients when they were awake, but instead I should be measuring it when they were asleep. So I got a small grant, I built a sleep laboratory, and we started to measure their sleep. And there we found remarkable results. And at that moment, I started to wonder, is the sleep disruption that I saw in the dementia patients not simply a symptom of their dementia? Could it actually be an underlying cause? We're now learning that there seems to be quite a significant and even a causal relationship between sleep and your risk for Alzheimer's disease. Now, Alzheimer's disease is a form of dementia, typified by problems with learning and memory and general cognitive decline. And there seem to be a collection of proteins that go awry in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. One of those proteins is a sticky toxic protein called beta amyloid, and the other protein is called tau. How is sleep related to these pathological proteins of Alzheimer's disease? Well, first, what we know at an epidemiological level is that individuals who are sleeping less than 6 hours a night on average have a significantly higher risk of going on to develop more of those beta amyloid toxic proteins in the brain later in life. We also know that sleep disorders, particularly things such as insomnia and also sleep apnea, both of those disorders are associated with a significantly higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease later in life. But that's just simply associational evidence. That just shows that those things seem to go hand in hand. It doesn't prove causality. But recently, we actually have identified that causal evidence. So if you take a human being and you deprive them of sleep for just one single night, or you even just selectively deprive them of deep non-REM sleep for one single night, the next day you see an immediate increase in that toxic protein beta amyloid, either circulating in their bloodstream, circulating in the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain and the spinal cord. And most recently, using new brain scanning technology, people have identified an immediate buildup in that amyloid protein in the brain itself after just one night of bad sleep. But if that's true, then what is it about sleep that prevents the escalation of these Alzheimer's disease pathology proteins? Well, a number of years ago, a scientist called Makan Nedergaard made a remarkable discovery. She was studying mice, and what she found was essentially a cleansing system in the brain. And you may have heard of this before. It's called the lymphatic system. But we didn't think that the brain actually had its own sewage system. And firstly, what she discovered was that indeed the brain does have its own cleansing system. It's called the glymphatic system, named after the cells that make it up in the brain, called the glial cells. Now, if that wasn't remarkable enough, she went on to make two more fundamental discoveries. First, what she found is that that cleansing system of the brain isn't always switched on in high flow volume throughout the 24-hour period. Instead, it was specifically when those mice fell asleep, and then when they went into deep non-REM sleep, did that sewage system kick into high gear. The final thing that she discovered, and this is why it's relevant to our conversation regarding Alzheimer's disease, is that one of the toxic metabolic byproducts that sleep was clearing away at night was this sticky, toxic protein, beta amyloid. So in other words, if we're not getting that sleep that we need every single night, then we're not clearing away all of the waste products that develop during the day. Because from a biochemical perspective, wakefulness is low-level brain damage, whereas sleep is your sanitary salvation. Just a few years ago, scientists in Boston, using very clever new MRI technology, found a very similar pulsing, cleansing mechanism in the human brain as well. And so this is the evidence that teaches us of a very powerful relationship between sleep and your risk of Alzheimer's disease. Now, some of this may sound a little bit disheartening or depressing, because we know that as we get older, our sleep, particularly that deep quality of sleep, when that cleansing system is normally switched on, that deep quality sleep typically declines as we go into old age. And our risk for Alzheimer's disease generally increases as we get older. But I think there's actually something hopeful here, because unlike many of the other factors that are associated with aging and Alzheimer's disease, for example, changes in the physical structure of the brain, or even changes in the blood flow dynamics of the brain, those are fiendishly difficult to treat, and medicine has no good wholesale approaches. But that sleep is a missing piece in the explanatory puzzle of aging and Alzheimer's disease is exciting because we may be able to do something about it. What if we could start to augment and improve or enhance human sleep in midlife? Because it's usually in midlife when we start to see the decline in deep sleep beginning. If we were to be able to improve deep sleep quality in midlife, could we shift from a model of late-stage treatment to instead a model of midlife prevention? Could we go from a model of sick care to a model of health care? And in doing so, could we actually bend the arrow of Alzheimer's risk down on itself? That's something that I am incredibly excited about, and something that we're actively studying at my sleep center.